My name is Michael Tillinger, and thank you very much for allowing me to address you. I've come from Johannesburg 2 days ago, and this is my first visit outside of South Africa and my first lecture outside of South Africa on the subject of our discoveries and pushing back the envelope of time on human history and ancient human civilizations. I'm going to be sharing something with you that only a handful of my closest friends have heard so far. In the process of putting this together and bouncing ideas off and so forth. And I hope you enjoy. It certainly is going to raise a few eyebrows, and I believe force certain areas of our historic society to rewrite certain sections of our history books. It's extremely exciting work, and it fits perfectly into everything I've ever studied, and I believe it provides the crucial missing clues that so many other researchers and authors and scientists have been looking for many, many decades. And therefore it gives me absolute great pleasure to be in a position where I live, to be able to walk outside of my front door and literally stumble upon ancient artifacts, because we live right in the middle of this ancient civilization that we're now uncovering on a daily basis. Firstly, we need to ask, and I think you've probably picked up this sentiment with various other speakers here over the last 2 days, is how much do we really know about our human origins and human history? And if history is written by the victors, within that statement lies a very crucial clue that tells us how little we actually know. Because if history is written by the victors, that means during every conflict, every major global conflict, and there have been thousands of conflicts over the 6,000 odd years since our current civilization was supposed to have first started, if there have been thousands of conflicts over thousands of years, how much do we really know if we dilute the knowledge, the original source of information, by, let's say, 50% every time there's a global conflict? If history is written by the victors, because that's what that statement tells us, doesn't it? So let's have a quick look. If we apply normal basic statistics to this, the answer is quite shocking. And I want to start off with this because it's important for us to keep this in mind as we start delving into ancient human history and finding things that do not make any sense to us. The reason they don't make any sense to us is because we've been so dumbed down. History books is written by the victors, and it is always written with an agenda. And all you need to do is, if we lose 50% of knowledge per event, if we start with 100%, by the time you get to event number 8, we already know less than 1% of the original truth, if you want to call it that. The original source. How close to the truth that was, I don't know, but let's assume it was as close to the truth as we can get. At this stage, the Sumerian tablets seem to be the oldest written record that we have deciphered, that we can understand, that makes any kind of sense. So in 6,000 years of the Sumerian tablets telling us what it was like, and is the original source, can you imagine the dilution of knowledge and information that we've had? What's most interesting is by the time you get to event number 124, that long number there is actually known as Planck's constant, 10 to the minus 34, which is anything less than that is not permitted by the laws of physics. So by the time we get to event 125, we know less than is permitted by the laws of physics. So I'll leave that with you. It's an interesting point of departure. And a very important little word that I've heard mentioned many times over the last 2 days, the word mythology. It is a completely distorted meaning of the word that we use today. Because the original word mythos in Greek didn't mean imaginary. It did not mean fairy tales and stories that you tell. It actually meant words, written words. It meant stories and legends told that were sworn to be true by gods and by kings and priests. And suddenly, somehow, in around 1270, I believe, I found that's the furthest back that I can date it, is when suddenly we start using the word mythology in the context we use it today. Like fairy tales, imaginary stories told by people, which is really, really preposterous, because that suggests that anyone before 1270, people before 1270 didn't really have a history. They just imagined everything. And that's highly impossible, implausible. So it's not imaginary. And what you need to do every time you read the word mythology, just replace that word with history. Mythological becomes historical. Mythology becomes history. And suddenly, our whole history as a human race changes dramatically. Because suddenly these events of the ancient past makes completely different sense to us. My talk and lecture is really in search of the human origins. And I call it the Great Human Puzzle. I delve quite deeply into it in my first book, Slave Species of God, which was released in late 2005. Which was then followed by the discovery of what we now call Adam's Calendar. So it's been a continuation of work that is that's somehow leading me in a direction that I can't avoid. And if we get caught in this search for human origins, it gets really, really weird. And I'm sure that all of you that have gone and researched human origins, the more you research this, the weirder it gets. And the further back in time you go, the weirder it gets. Just like science and physics. The higher you get in your knowledge and studying, the weirder stuff gets. And the weirder people that don't study that stuff think you are. Because you start talking about these weird things that they don't understand. And they think, well, he's a mad scientist or he's just a weird, cranky archaeologist. But it's just because this stuff really gets weird. So you've got to keep all that in mind when you start dealing with these things from great antiquity. So where is the oldest structure on Earth? If we're looking for the origins of humankind, where is the oldest structure on Earth? Well, the obvious answer would be like the pyramids, right? And some of you will say, well, Stonehenge is older than the pyramids, or whatever we know, or we think we know about these structures. And this is a well-known one. And this was said to have also been built around 2400 BC or around there. But obviously many archaeologists and researchers will argue with you and say there's ample geological evidence that it comes from at least 10,000 BC or somewhere around there when there was a lot of water in the desert based on the erosion around the Sphinx and so forth. This is a well-known temple, an Inca temple up above the mountains of Cusco. You just saw some pictures a little earlier of this. We have no idea how they did this, but we're not going to delve into that. But these are just ancient structures, and we're looking for origins of humankind, right? So we're looking at these ancient structures, wondering where the hell did the first people emerge, and what were they doing? And this is the temple at Baalbek, those giant monoliths that many of you are well familiar with. But shouldn't we rather say, instead of looking for the oldest structures on Earth to find the origins of humankind and the first people that lived on Earth, shouldn't we rather ask, well, where's the cradle of humankind? Because if we find the cradle of humankind, maybe we'll find the structures that those first people left behind. And that's really the tack that I took. And I started looking, well, genetically, how far can we trace back the first humans, and where did they come from? Where did they live? What did they do? Well, genetically, we can trace back the first humans somewhere to southern Africa. And the more genetic studies you do, the more you realize it seems to be pushing the first humans further and further south. That is not well liked by mainstream archaeology because they want to sell us the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania as where the first, the progenitors or the first humans appeared and so forth, which is really not necessarily true. But the mitochondrial Eve studies have shown us that there were a small group of females that gave birth to the first humans on Earth, and they can be traced somewhere in southern Africa. And this isn't supported by what Edmund spoke about as the Y chromosomes in men that suddenly emerge at around 60,000 years. We see this emergence and this exodus out of southern Africa of the first humans. But that doesn't tell us what those people were doing in further south before 60,000 years ago. And that becomes quite interesting, because they must have lived there before 60,000 years if they suddenly emerged and moving out of Africa at about 60,000 years ago. What's interesting when you look at the Sumerian tablets, it's exactly what they tell us. They tell us in great detail who the first humans were, what they did, where they lived, why they were there, who created them, and who they prayed to, and all these things. And in great detail, we get this in many, many Sumerian tablets. There are two great examples of Sumerian tablets. They're called the Sumerian King List. The one on the right-hand side is probably the more well-known one. But the one on the left is in the Oslo Museum, and it talks about about a number of kings that lived before the flood, and it names them by name, and it tells you exactly how long they ruled. And the total number of years that they ruled before, up to the flood of about 12,000 years ago, that main event that seems to have wiped out civilization, it tells you the names of those kings. There's 8 names of those kings and how long they actually ruled. The one on the right-hand side is the more popular kings list, Sumerian kings list, and that actually gives you even more details, and it tells you, and sorry, those number of kings ruled for 112,000 years, I think, 212,000 years. And the kings list on the right-hand side gives you 10 names of kings before the flood and tells you that they ruled for 240,000 years. So it added 2 more names and actually took it right up to the flood from when the Homo sapiens first seemed to have emerged on planet Earth. So you get some very interesting historic and genetic corroboration and crossing over from these 2 particular tablets. But there are actually 5 of these Sumerian kings lists, and they seem to corroborate one another. What some important definitions from the Sumerian tablets that we get are, first of all, the first Holy Trinity. You've seen these names before, Anu, Enlil, and Enki. That's where we seem to get all the other Holy Trinities from afterwards. What I believe, what the Bible calls the Anakim, or the giants, I believe to be the same as what the Sumerian tablets call the Anunnaki, Anunnaki. Whether there's a coincidence there, I'm not so sure. Very importantly, the first name, the first mention of the gods in the Bible was Elohim. Elohim was plural gods. It wasn't God, the singular God that it became later. So remember, every time you read God in the Bible, you should actually read the gods. And many people are not aware of that, so they get confused with this religious thing, and like, God's going to punish me and kill my children for 7 generations after because I tied my shoelaces on a Saturday morning. So Allah is a derivative of the word Elohim, and so it also means plural. In Genesis 6, we get introduced to the Nephilim and the sons of the gods who came down and shagged the daughters of man and started all the problems that we have on planet Earth, and so it goes. And we read some really interesting stuff. But all of these above characters all had one thing in common. They were all obsessed with gold. And that suddenly becomes really, really curious. Why would God, the creator of the universe and all things in it, be obsessed with gold? In Genesis 2, he hasn't even created Eve yet. Okay? Eve doesn't exist. Adam is on his own. And God already says to him, I'm going to take you to the land of Havilah, where there's water. Water is good, the land's good, and there is gold. Because I want you to mine this stuff for me, you bastard. And that's pretty much what happened. It's as simple as that. But what you find when you study the Bible in detail is that it's got absolutely nothing to do with religion. But it's actually a great historic book of scientific information and ancient knowledge that is being covered up by all these stories that confuse people. But we're still in search of the cradle of humankind. We haven't found it yet. What I can tell you is that in South Africa, the Sterkfontein Caves are sold to the world as the cradle of humankind. And rightfully so, because there's some really impressive stuff in there. Because that's where you find Mrs. Pless. Now just called Pless, because they're not so sure whether she's a Mrs. anymore. You find Littlefoot, which created a big stir a couple of years ago when Littlefoot was first excavated. I think they're about to excavate the full skeleton now, very soon. The only problem with this is that this is a huge con. It's a problem because this has got nothing to do with humankind. This is the cradle of hominid kind, because these are all Australopithecus. They're 2 million years old, 2 to 5 million years old ape-like species, upright walking apes. They've got nothing to do with clear-thinking Homo sapiens like these handsome people sitting in this room that can think and reason. Okay? These had nothing to do with Homo sapiens. So this is not the cradle of humankind. This should be called the cradle of hominid kind. That's what we should be selling to the world here. So where in South Africa is the cradle of humankind? Well, I find the evidence lies scattered all over the country, actually, because when you start looking at the evidence, and until recently, I thought that it went back to about 100,000 years ago, but because of our discoveries, I've had to change my mind. And that's incidentally what I like to do. I will formulate my theories based on the artifacts and based on the evidence that I find. You'll find a lot of archaeologists and scientists work the arse about face way, where they try and fit the archaeological and scientific evidence to fit their theories. Now, that's not a scientific approach to anything. That's not going to get you anywhere. So you've got to constantly move and change your theory and your hypothesis based on the discoveries you make. And that changes the world. That one thing that remains constant is change, right? So about 100,000 years ago, we find these amazing artifacts from the Blombos Cave in the Western Cape. This was dated to be about 80,000 years ago, 80,000 years old. Notice those very interesting scratches on it that are in the cross shapes. I'm not going to go too much detail into this because, incidentally, the lecture I'm giving you now is normally a full day, but I'm cramming it into an hour and a bit. So this is a fantastic story about how important these cross shapes are and how the reoccurrence of all these images, how they appear in all kinds of places, especially in Great Zimbabwe as well, and some of the ruins there and so forth. Notice the similar kind of carvings on this stone, and this comes from a cave from the Vonnegut Cave, which has been excavated by Peter Beaumont, one of the top archaeologists in South African history, for the past 20 years or so. And they found evidence of habitation for well over 1 million years. And not of Homo sapiens, but of Homo sapiens and then pre-Homo sapiens species. Very interesting. But you can see the similarity of the conscious art on this rock that already appears at this early stage. The Twin Rivers cave in Zambia, the painting itself has been dated to be about 30,000 years old. Notice the color of that creature. And the paint fragments at the bottom of that cave were dated to be about 400,000 years old. So somewhere in between lies the truth. It just shows you how inaccurate some of our dating techniques are. And if you take a feather from a duck and a piece of its beak, different scientists will tell you how old the duck is and tell you different dates. Similar kind of thing happened here. This is a very important site that was recently discovered by the tourism industry. It's called the Tsodilo Serpent Worship Site. It's in northern Botswana. Creator Mutwa knows the site really well. He speaks about it in great detail. He calls it the creation cave of the human race. Now, that's very interesting because by the time we finish this presentation, you'll understand that this creation of the human race is a recurring theme in the ruins and the structures and the cultures of Southern Africa. And many of these sites have direct references to the creation of the human race. And that becomes really interesting because this leads us to the three common denominators that I found in all of human history. Gold, slavery, and the winged serpent. You can't escape those. No matter how far back you go, no matter how you search, you cannot escape that. Gold, I mentioned already, even in Genesis, God was obsessed with gold. He wanted it badly. Allah is obsessed with gold. In Hinduism, in every ancient civilization and culture, gold is the obsession of humankind. You can't get away from it. It doesn't make any sense why early humans would have been obsessed with gold for the purpose of hanging it around their neck. Okay, so that doesn't quite wash for me. The concept of slavery is just a really strange one. Why early humans and so-called hunter-gatherers, supposedly, would have gone over the hill there and captured a bunch of people and said, well, let's get those people to come do our work for us and we can just sit back on our asses and do nothing. It's just a weird concept. You know, we'll make them hunt for us and skin the animals for us, and it doesn't quite wash with me. And yet, as far back as you can go, God ordains slavery. He tells you how to treat your slaves and under what conditions you can kill your slaves if they behaved really badly. It's really unacceptable. And then obviously the winged serpent, or the caduceus, which was incidentally also the Sumerian symbol for Enki, the god Enki, the creator god, who was supposed to have created the human race, according to the Sumerian tablets. Well, this was also his symbol, the winged serpent, and from there we see all kinds of adaptations of winged serpents all over the world in human history. Every ancient civilization has a ritual that deals with winged serpents and snake worship, and so it goes. But there also are scientific and physics explanations for this that I'm not going to go into right now, but you've heard all about that earlier this weekend. What real evidence do we have of these early humans? Who were these first people? How did they live? What did they do? Well, we have evidence of ancient stone ruins in southern Africa. Unfortunately, these have often been called cattle kraal of little historic value. And this has been going on for decades and decades, probably about a century. And that's been one of the saddest things that could have happened to these ancient ruins in southern Africa. Because these cattle kraals of little historic value are probably the most priceless possessions that we have, and artifacts and remains of ancient civilizations we have on this planet, and thousands have been destroyed. I'm going to show you a few of them just to start off with and get you going. I'm going to just let you look at them for a few seconds and carry on, and then see if you notice some of the walls are still 2 meters wide. Most of them are circular or oval with internal structures. Notice the fact that the central structure is not the only structure, but the area around it gives you an impression that it was a much bigger continuous settlement that linked to the central round, or in this case it's a bit squashed so it looks more oval, rounded structure. And don't think that those big rocks around the side are part of the bedrock. Those are all part of the original stone ruin structure that have just been fallen down and moved by floodwaters and so forth. Notice here, you see this little path that runs here? See a little path that runs there? I'll get to those a bit later. What's interesting, many of these ruins have got these small little circular structures that are no more than 1.5 meters wide. Some of them are even smaller. And no one's ever been able to explain what these are for. This is one of the great mysteries. But if you ask any South African archaeologist, they'll tell you these are all cattle kraal built by the Bantu people. And now they actually have pinpointed it to what they call the Bakoni people. The Bakoni people, none of these ruins are older than about 200 or 300 years old. And that's what you will be told by the archaeologists and the historians in South Africa. And they now pin it on the Bakoni people, the poor Bakoni people. They've built all these, and you'll see how ludicrous that is. And what I find so pathetically funny is that when you entertain these archaeologists, when I bring them into my museum that I've built, and I tell them I show them these ruins, they tell me, oh no, I've seen all of it, we know all these. Well, they don't know all these, they just don't know what to say. So they don't want to be confronted, and they rather leave instead of being confronted and having to answer questions that they don't have answers for. I find that really funny. This is a very important one, and you'll see why a little bit later. And you start seeing some interesting geometric shapes in horseshoes, with a circle inside, and a stone right in the middle of it. These little stone towers at the front of it, at the entrance of it. Here's a good example how that extended structure has been eroded and washed away. It's long gone. Thousands of these are in forests in Sappy Land, so the South African Forestry Company. And you start seeing the emergence of interesting figures and well-recognized shapes. There's another repetition of that horseshoe shape, or the ohm in electronics, ohm shape with the two towers at the entrance to it. This is just a spectacular helicopter view, and if you look carefully, you see all the stuff here. It's all used to be one continuous settlement that's now covered by soil. You can only see it from the air. When you walk on these mountains, you have absolutely no idea that you're walking on ancient ruins that are covered by soil. You have no idea until you see it from the air. Did you notice the one thing I've asked you to look for? No doors or entrances. None of these ruins have any doors or entrances. That has been one of the great mysteries that has puzzled archaeologists, and they've not been able to answer that. There's a very distinct Asian connection. There's a South African historian called Cyril Hromnik, Dr. Cyril Hromnik, who wrote a book called Indo-Africa in 1981, and in there he draws very, very clear links to ancient Indian and Hindu miners, gold miners, called the Makumatis, the Tera and the Makumati people, which is the foundation that we started in 2003, the Makumati Foundation. And when the Portuguese arrived in this part of the world in 1481, around there, they called it the Terra dos Makumates, the land of the Makumati people. Now, Makumati in ancient Sanskrit means gold merchants, and was an Indian or a Dravidian sect of gold merchants in India that were in southern Africa about 2,000 years, maybe even 3,000 years ago, mining gold. There's a direct link to these Makumati Hindu gold miners and gold merchants. And we know it by having discovered thousands of these dolmen that are directly linked to the Hindu tradition. Hindu symbolisms and symbols, the ruins have been shaped in, like this one, which is a well-known Hindu symbol of fertility. And this particular one, very close to where I live, which is about 98 meters in circumference, just to give you an idea of the size. This is also directly linked to the Hindu gold miners. However, once again, at the moment, other than our work on this ruin, the official archaeological final word on this is from a survey in 1939, in which they say they found no entrance to the ruin. And that's how it stands. How many of these ruins are there? This is where it becomes really interesting, and where it starts to change your entire perception of what the hell was going on in this part of the world. In 1891, Theodore Bent, some of you may have heard of Theodore Bent, he was a great British archaeologist. He excavated a lot of southern Africa, a lot of Egypt, a lot of the Near East. He's written, I think he wrote several books that are absolutely fantastic. They are the authoritative books on southern African archaeology. And Theodore Bent was the first guy in 1891 to excavate Great Zimbabwe. He writes extensively about 2 meters of sediment of a gold mining culture and civilization. Now, 2 meters of sediment does not happen in a few hundred or a few thousand years. He reckoned in 1891 that there were about 4,000 stone ruins in southern Africa. In 1974, Roger Summers, there you can see a nice aerial shot of what it looks like in the part of the world that I live. There are ruins on every mountain. Wherever you lift your eyes up, that's what it looks like. Pretty much like that. Roger Summers estimated there to be about 20,000, and he puts a beautiful little schematic and how he worked out his theory and his numbers, how he reached his numbers and so forth. And then by 2007, that's me, I estimated that there were at least 100,000 of these. Well, 6 months after that, I changed my mind, and it was about 200,000. And what's interesting is that when I had a phone conversation with the retired head of archaeology at Wits University in Johannesburg, Professor Revel Mason, I called him up and I asked him, what do you know about these stone ruins? Because I believe you've excavated a lot of them and so forth. And he just opened up and he told me a whole bunch of stuff. And one of the things he volunteered, and he said to me, well, there are at least 100,000 of these ruins. And I was quite taken aback, because that's the first time I heard any archaeologist volunteer that kind of information. Well, the guy is retired, so he doesn't give a damn anymore. He can't get fired. And, and I said to him, well, that's interesting, because that's pretty much the number that I've got, 100,000 or more. And he said, yeah, and then I said, but now how does that fit into the population? How many people must have lived there? And he said, well, there must have been well over 1 million people. And I said, well, that doesn't fit the population model, does it? And he said, well, then they couldn't have been 100,000. Just like that, bang, end of conversation. Thank you very much. So just as I thought he was coming out the closet, he went straight back in. Anyway, bless his heart, he volunteered that information, and it gave me encouragement to realize that there's a lot more. So I started counting. Don't you love that photograph? I mean, this is just spectacular. This is one of the ruins that we've cleared for tourism. There's clearly a humanoid sculptured rock there that looks at this wall, and so it goes. They're just incredible things. I started counting. And by the time I finished counting, I hope you can see what I can see. Right? Just look carefully. I'll point them out to you. It's everywhere. Top right. And once again, look at the Look at the road running at the bottom here. And these roads that come out of each ruin. Every one of these ruins was at one stage linked to these ancient roads. Every single one of them. Look at this mountaintop. Look at these circles. They're just circles. This is what the countryside in southern Africa looks like. Once you know what you're looking for, just go on Google and you will not believe your eyes. It does not stop. I've identified what I call three vanished cities. Each one is larger than Johannesburg today. More than 10,000 square kilometers in their original state. There's three of them. This one is between Rustenburg and Botswana, which is more than 100 kilometers in length and probably about 60 kilometers wide. This is part of that same settlement. The other one is where I live, in Watervalboven in Mpumalanga. That goes all the way from Nelspruit to a place called Badplaas, and it's more than 130 kilometers and probably about 60 or 80 kilometers wide. And then in southern Zimbabwe, which incorporates Great Zimbabwe and Victoria Falls, that whole area there. So three ancient cities, vanished cities, that were as dense as this in their original state. And by the time I finished counting, I counted at least 3 million ruins. That gives you an idea of what it looked like. The whole place looked something like this. Now, once again, when you walk on these mountains, you have no idea that you're walking on these ruins. You can only see them from the air. So at this stage, we now know that this constitutes the largest and most mysterious ancient stone settlement on Earth. They consist of dwellings, workplaces, places of worship, ancient roads and terraces, and they cover well over 450,000 square kilometers. They cover most of South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Mozambique. Agricultural terraces that run for thousands and thousands of kilometers for crops and livestock. To feed how many people, you may ask? And therein lies the huge mystery. How many people? The numbers do not make sense. 3 million ruins. Remember, that 3 million is just in one ancient city. But there are three ancient cities, three vanished cities. So you're looking at over 10 million of these stone circles in southern Africa. What does that do to the ancient population numbers in southern Africa? I don't know. You tell me. Because I'm running out of ideas here. If you ascribe 10 people to each ruin, you got 100 million people living down there. It doesn't make any sense. Do you see where this is going? It's crazy. How do you handle this information? What do you do with it? Until you see the terraces. This terrace, one very brave archaeologist who's a Theosophical Society member on the quiet side, in secrecy, ventured to tell me that this is at least 5,000 years old, and he gave me a number of reasons why this terrace is at least 5,000 years old, and he said it could be a lot older for various reasons. Mountains are covered in terraces. Entire mountains are just covered in these terraces that are so old that in most places you don't realize they're terraces until you go walk there and you realize that these are actually ancient terraces. We're about to take core samples of some of these terraces and send them to the University of Port Elizabeth to do analyses of the different layers and what we can find, what kind of crops there were, what kind of soil it was, anything else that we can determine from these core samples. And then you got these roads that run all the way up the mountain. Ancient roads between the terraces, between the circles, and some weird things like here. You'll notice you'll see better pictures of these are stone ruins that are circular ruins that are clustered together like beehives, right packed into each other. I'll tell you what those were in a few minutes. Notice that and this looks like you're somewhere in Mexico, somewhere South America, or the Incas. Like, this doesn't look like South Africa, and yet it's right up the mountain. I drive past this every day. So clearly we had a civilization here that no one has ever seen before, that we know nothing about, and that has vanished. The ancient roads run for thousands and thousands of miles. And they link, as I said, every single one of these circles was linked by an ancient road. Every one. Where it's not linked, it means that it's been destroyed by farmers or agriculture or whatever. But originally, each one was linked. Okay? And there's a very good reason, very specific reason why they were linked. Again, look at that spiderweb effect that shows you that this was part of a much larger extended structure in its original state. There's a road coming in there at the top, linking in here. A beautiful example of the road running at the bottom. That one running right up the mountain. Remember that these roads, they're older than the wheel. The wheel wasn't invented at this stage. So you ask yourself, well, what were these roads for? What kind of transport were they using? What were they transporting? Why did they need roads? And so forth. It's a very simple and obvious question. And some places these roads run up steep mountains. I mean, up a steep mountain that you struggle to walk up. And the road goes straight up. No horse or a car or anything is going to pull anything up there. So what the hell are these roads for? Or are they roads? There you got another great example of a beautiful road. Remember, all this is gone. This is covered by soil. And I might as well tell you now that this was, in my opinion, this was covered by the floodwaters of 12,000 odd years ago. That's why there's so little left. All of it is covered by soil. And what you see sticking out now is what was rebuilt since the flood. So the only things we see that survived are the things that were rebuilt from about 12,000 years ago. Everything else that's older is covered by the soil. And then here, you've got these, again, that cluster effect of that honeycomb, those smaller circular, they're probably about this size, about 2 or 3 meters across, just packed together, like a honeycomb kind of effect. Just to show you that these roads don't end. They linked every single one of these things together. What else do we know about these ruins? We know that Great Zimbabwe was the grandest of them all, and you can see immediately it's the same architecture, same civilization, especially this picture here. Tells you that Great Zimbabwe was part of the same civilization, except it was much grander, much bigger. It was obviously intended for the chief, the big kahuna, and that's where he lived. And there's an interesting translation from the Sumerian tablets that tells us what Enki, that it was probably Enki's place that he built for himself. I'll get to the translation a little bit later. But you can see that this is also how little excavation has been done at Great Zimbabwe. There's just nothing. We know nothing about it. They haven't even touched the site. You know, this is all covered by soil. You can clearly see from this picture that those walls probably go down another 5 or 6 meters. There's a lifetime of work here for at least 100 archaeologists or 1,000 archaeologists, because this is a large site. And as far as cattle kraal, to reiterate what you said, if they had 10 million cattle kraal, there must have been a hell of a lot of cows around there that fed how many people? So the first reference of Great Zimbabwe comes to us in about 1510. However, since I've written this, I've discovered even an older reference. It takes us back to the mid-1400s. But let's stick with this now. Antonio Fernandes was a Portuguese explorer. He was part of the Degredados, or the unwashed. And they sent them out into Africa, and if they didn't come back, nobody lost any sleep. But luckily he came back, because he came back with some really interesting news of these incredible old ruins that no one's seen before, and he describes them in great detail. They were completely ruined. They were overgrown. When he asked the locals who built them, the locals said, "We don't know who built it, but it must have been the work of the devil, because man cannot build such a site." And then our archaeologists today tell us, no, the people that lived there built it. So, well, the people that lived there tell us they didn't build it. So, you're going to call them a liar. And so it goes. What was even more interesting is that they stumbled upon what they called the Karanga people, or the Kalanga people, or the Makaranga or Makalanga. The R and L get swapped around like they get in Japanese. And these people were actually sun-worshipping tribes in southern Africa. The people of the sun, Makalanga, Langa, sun. And that got very interesting. These are the ruins at Kami ruins in Zimbabwe in 1891. That's how ruined they were already. They hardly stood. There was hardly anything left. The discoveries at Great Zimbabwe are interesting. Just very briefly touch upon them. A copper object with triangular design, but it was found 5 feet below the surface. 5 feet of sediment, ladies and gentlemen, does not happen in a few hundred years or even 1,000 years at such levels at these ruins. The mysterious bird statues that no one has been able to explain what these Zimbabwe birds were all about. And then a lintel above the entrance to the Great Zimbabwe ruins with an inscription. That lintel is long gone. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that lintel is as prized a possession as the Ark of the Covenant, because it had an inscription on it that was never deciphered. In fact, when they brought the wise Moorish men from the east, they always seem to come from the east, they brought them down to decipher the script on the lintel. They couldn't decipher the language. And these guys knew all the languages in the world. That lintel is gone in some idiot's private possession somewhere. But they found letters like this. Theodore Bent found these letters on a rock in Botswana, which may have been the kind of letters that were used on the lintel in Great Zimbabwe, but we will not really know that. There are very direct and distinct links to the northern civilizations, ancient civilizations, Arabic, Roman, Phoenician, Egyptian, Maltese, and Sumerian. And here are the links. The oval shapes of the Arabic shrines and ruins that you find, well documented by Theodore Bent, because he excavated Arabia and those areas in great detail. A Phoenician constellation found on a wooden bowl in Zimbabwe, very distinct Phoenician. This Roman coin of Antoninus Pius was found 25 meters deep in a mine near Umtali. Antoninus Pius was 138 AD. So it tells us the Romans were there mining gold, 138 AD or around that period. This Egyptian headrest on the left is an Egyptian headrest, on the right is a Southern African headrest. See a similarity? Look at the concentric circles on the Southern African headrest. It stays in constant with the structure and the concentric structures of many of the ruins. And what's even more interesting is when you take a closer look on top of that African headrest, you see a beautifully carved Maltese cross. What the hell is a Maltese cross doing on a headrest in South Africa? Oops. Now suddenly you've got a link to the northern civilizations, to the Knights Templar, to the Knights of Malta, to the Christian origins of Christianity, and so you go. It just gets really and really weird. As I said, it gets weirder and weirder the further back you go. And so let's look at the origins of the cross, since we now found a Maltese cross. So as far as my research tells me, that the origin of the cross actually comes from the Sumerians. The Sumerian planet of the crossing, as they refer to it, or this planet called Nibiru that they refer to, and that they called it the planet of the crossing, and they often represented it with this cross, which I personally believe was also then the origin of all the religions that came out of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, that then used the cross, that it became the Christian symbol. The Makalanga, the sun worship culture of Southern Africa, children of the sun. But the real kicker here is the name Abantu. Nobody has ever known where the Bantu people come from, the origins of the Bantu people, and especially the name of Abantu, the Bantu people. Well, Credo Mutwa told me that the name Abantu actually is a reference to Abantu. The only two places where you get the root word Ntu is in Sumeria and in South Africa, as far as I've been able to research. Ntu is an Antu, the wife of Anu, and Abantu are children of Antu, which was a Sumerian goddess. So the links to Sumeria and Sumerian civilization get thicker and thicker. There's a Sumerian cross, an original cross with wings, the winged planet, and on the right-hand side is a petroglyph that I found on a rock near where I live, a cross with wings coming out of it. They're so badly eroded, but you can see there are actually 3 lines that come out on the right-hand side of that particular petroglyph. If you look carefully, it's difficult to take it. It all depends where the sun is when you're there photographing it. These thousands and thousands of crosses in circles on a giant glacier rock. This is andesite. It's the same hardness as diorite. Very, very hard. The erosion on this suggests that this is way over 100,000 years old. If you just look at the erosion patterns and also the cracks through these circles and that. The cracks would have occurred after they made the petroglyphs. They would not have made the petroglyphs over the cracks. So there's also telltale signs as to how old these are. And this cross in a circle in ancient African tradition means Mabona, Lord of Light. Interesting link to the Sumerian and Egyptian belief systems. Sun worship cultures in Southern Africa, Makalanga, children of the sun, many hundreds if not thousands of petroglyphs of circular structures radiating rays coming out of them. And then the Ankh. There's an Egyptian Ankh in a circle with radiating rays coming out of the circle. And this, my dear friends, is way over 100,000 years old, probably way over 200,000 years old, this petroglyph, just based on the erosion of that on the glyph itself. What is all this ancient activity in Southern Africa all about? It's always all about gold. Always gold. Thousands of ancient gold mines. And wherever there were circles, they're always gold mines. You can't get away from it. In this picture, you can count at least 8 circles, and there's some terraces, bang. It goes down into the valley. You can see the terraces coming up here. There's a big circle there. There's a circle there. There's a circle. There's a smaller one, another one. There's at least 8 circles there. And right next to them in the mountains, there are thousands of these mines. Now, these mines were reopened in the 1850s by the gold rush of the 1850s into the the early 1900s. And the modus operandi of these 1800 gold diggers was look for the stone circles and you'll find an ancient gold mine. And they just kept reopening these ancient gold mines. It becomes very evident when you start walking around there. I put this here because of the orbs. It was just incredible. I mean, you can hardly see the subject. It's so thick with orbs. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. There are a lot of souls in that mine. There I'm sitting next to the edge of that mine over there. That's one that slipped through the gold mining into Anglo-Americans' fingers. It's not on any register. It's on private land. We found it flying over it in a microlight. And now I'm sitting on the edge of it. I mean, we don't know how deep it is. It's way over 100 meters deep. It could have been so deep that even thousands of years of soil shift and sediment falling into it still hasn't filled it up. That's why it still survives. And it's quite spooky sitting on the edge. I must tell you, I was quite nervous because if you slip in there, you're a goner. And guess what? This gold mine is about a kilometer, or maybe not, about a kilometer away from Sheba Gold Mine, which is today still regarded as the richest gold mine on earth. And the story gets more and more beautiful as you go. This is what one of the translations of Enki is that he says, great rivers there rapidly flowed, and abode by the flowing waters Enki for himself established. He established a fortress for his house, which I believe to be Great Zimbabwe, and other places, or the other ruins, where the workers would live and where the bowels of the earth to enter. Places of deepness he determined for the heroes into the earth's bowels to descend to extract the gold. And I believe that that's what that little passage refers to. Great Zimbabwe. Anne Kritzinger is the head of geology at Zimbabwe University, and about 2 years ago, so she published a paper about 80 pages on the Zimbabwe ruins, what was referred to in all historic books as slave pits or animal pits or grain pits inside the ruins. Well, she didn't buy it, just like I don't buy it, and she went and did some research. And in her paper, you can go and Google it, or I'll put it on my website. You clearly see, and there you can see those cluster structures again, linked by a road. Look, road linking everything, always linked by a road. She proves conclusively that these were gold flotation extraction tanks. That they extracted gold, because each one of these has an inlet and an outlet, and she got a yield of about 1.78 grams of gold per ton at some of these outlets, which is a reasonably good gold mine still today. Just to prove to you that there was a gold mining culture there at Great Zimbabwe. These are a crucible found, and this ingot for making interesting molds out of gold, and today they still make them out of copper. The mysterious birds. This has really baffled people for, hundreds of years. What were these birds for? Note the structure. It's very basic. It's like it comes from the bottom, and then it's almost just like they took a stone and they just carved it, very basically out of a stone. And it's always a bird on a pedestal. A bird on a pedestal. Very important. Bird on a pedestal. Look at this, especially that one on the right. Look at that one on the right, because you're going to see some rocks, giant rocks that look very similar to that. Very, very basic, very naive in their structure. But Theodore Bent put this together, and he showed that the goddess Hathor in Egypt and in the Near East was actually the goddess of gold mining and gold miners. And she loved the gold, and she protected the gold miners, and this is who they prayed to. So, and all the gold mines that he excavated in the Near East, he often found these drawings and these carvings of the goddess Hathor, or the bird on a pedestal at the entrance to the gold mine. And now suddenly the penny drops. Bingo! Bird on a pedestal. Where were most of the gold mines in the world? In southern Africa. Suddenly you realize that all these birds on pedestals, these Zimbabwean birds, were the earliest guardians of the early gold miners in a very, very rough and very raw form. And I'm going to show you some of the very rough and raw forms that I've discovered. Thousands of stones that have been very crudely carved into a broad base and a narrow tip. It's a bit squashed here. Broad base and a narrow tip. That is just spectacular. I was as happy as a little piglet when I discovered that one. You can see the smile on my face. And it's just ridiculous. And you literally fall over this stuff when you walk on the mountains. And I really mean that. That's not a metaphor. What's so special about these ruins? Well, the cattle kraal turned out to be a very clever cattle kraal intended for very clever cattle. Because most of these ruins, now let me rephrase that, many of these ruins show a very advanced knowledge of geometry and alignment, of precession and alignment, of geographical positioning and understanding north, south, east, west, solstices, equinoxes, and so forth. This one we figured out is really inspired by the 5 factor, and a lot more can be said about that. This one you saw earlier. This, I can tell you, I can go on for about 2 hours just about this room. It's spectacular. But all of them are very clearly built with a specific intention in mind, or a purpose in mind. And this is probably by far my favorite. Firstly, you notice that it was built in concentric circular shapes, which already indicates a knowledge of harmonic frequency and resonant frequency and all those kind of things. Stuff that we're only starting to understand when you start delving into sacred geometry. There you can see the really complex structure that it is. But by far my favorite discovery was when we realized that when you extend that flattened part into a circle, you get a perfect hexagon. And when you deal with a hexagon, you start understanding that you're dealing with tetrahedrons and star tetrahedrons, and according to Nassim Haramein and other physicists of his caliber, are starting to understand now that the tetrahedron or the star tetrahedron could probably be or could possibly be the fundamental structure of all matter. And instead of looking for the fundamental particle, look for the fundamental structure, as Nassim often says in his lectures. So I find this specifically very, very personally gratifying for having discovered this. Look how perfectly it touches the inner structure. And there's a lot more work to be done on this. And there you go, star tetrahedron, fundamental structure of all matter. Sacred geometry, on the right there you can also see it's often referred to as the fruit of life. And obviously people like Leonardo, who belong to these secret societies, knew all about this, and you've seen this star tetrahedral structure. So these guys were building it into these ancient stone ruins on my doorstep where I live. And that's really quite lekker. But not only did they build these structures, before they built them, these buggers drew them. They were the first architects. And note, once again, no doors, no entrances. And it's very weird. You saw in your lecture earlier, I think it was your lecture, we saw all the little dots around some of those ruins. Stefan, I don't know if it was yours or somebody else. But again, that just doesn't make any sense. There's no entrances, no doors, all closed, a closed circuit, and then these little dots around the perimeter of the inside dots, of the inside structures. This is a great example because once again, we got a beautiful crack through this. So we look at the erosion on the crack, and we look at the kind of patina that this rock has, and we realize that this is at least 50,000 years old. this little petroglyph here, based on the erosion on the crack. And there again is just another look at the cross in a circle with the wings coming off it. Great is the all-seeing Lord of the sky, Mabona. That's what the African tradition calls it. And I believe that we've discovered a new class of stone tools. This is what some of the tools look like that I believe they might have used to carve these petroglyphs with. It's a suggestion. And that's what they look like before they carved the petroglyphs. And this is what they look like after they carved the petroglyphs with the tips broken off. And they can then discarded. So what you do, so when you find these, you look at the patina on the rock here, and you realize the patina has grown for 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters thick. So you're looking at 50, 100, 200,000 year old stone tools that have been lying idly after they've been discarded. And some more anomalous stone tools, just thousands of these, just wherever you go. This is a beautiful phallus that was used in some ritual. It's about 30 centimeters long. And it's also beautiful based on the patina growth in that. It's also way over 50, 100,000 years old. Then we get many of these weird holes in rocks that show distinct sedimentation of metal, molten metal around the rims. They use this for some sort of ritual where they put molten metal in. 100,000 years ago, we weren't supposed to have metal. Melting metal 100,000 years ago. Come on! What else do we know about these ancient civilizations? They were obsessed with monoliths. Wherever you go in the area that I live, you just see monoliths everywhere. They're just beautiful. And then in Zimbabwe again, but unfortunately all these monoliths are gone, carted off to private collections. And then the monoliths become sculptures. This looks like a budding Leonardo or a Michelangelo. This is a stone that's standing on the island between the two roads into Nelspruit. And this, if you've heard of the Leidenberg head sculpture, on the left, this is one of the 6 Leidenberg heads that was discovered. We know nothing about the Leidenberg head sculpture, except that they made these 6 beautiful ceramic heads. And there is a sculpture of what I believe is a similar kind of creature, except that sculpture is 50, 100,000 years old, maybe more. So suddenly the 100 AD to 900 AD culture of the Leidenberg heads that they've been ascribed to changes its age dramatically overnight, just by stopping and looking on the rocks, on the island, on the highway. And then the birds become monoliths as well. You can see here how they even carved out the wing. That chap standing there is about 6'8". He's a tall bugger. Just to give you an idea how big that is. It's a close-up. Where's the flagship of all this? And that's where we get to Adam's calendar. No doubt. It's probably the oldest, well, it is the oldest functioning stone calendar that I know of. That's just a more cruder look at it. Look at that beautiful carved edge over there. That rock is so hard, you have no idea. I tried to chip off a piece with a hammer the other day. I couldn't. I could not actually chip a piece of the rock off. I hit it about 10 times so hard, I eventually thought I was scared of getting a chip in my eye, so I stopped and I just went and picked up a small piece because we're about to start a simulated erosion test in a laboratory at the University of Port Elizabeth. So I wasn't chipping the calendar, by the way. That's an aerial view from the helicopter. The tree on the right, that's the north, this is the south, east is at the bottom, and west comes out there. Where that wooden pole is at the top, that's where the stone man stood. That was removed in 1992, and we found him. Note this rock here, very important, very nicely, beautifully carved, pointed rock. That's the northern view. You see how north-south dissects the 2 calendar stones perfectly. Northern view, look at the little tree on the horizon. Very important. Also a discovery we made about 7 years after finding it. That's the southern view, just to show you the opposite view. That's the view where the stone man stood, looking east at the sunrise on the vernal equinox. There are alignments of 5 monoliths. And that's what the stone man looks like. He was taken out in 1992, and they put a plaque on him to commemorate the opening of the Blue Swallow Reserve, the endangered blue swallows. They had no idea they were desecrating the oldest site on Earth. So we're doing our best trying to raise funds for the foundation to take the stone man back and put him in place. But we don't know which way he faced. So before we put him back, we first need to try and figure out which way did he face. Otherwise, we might desecrate the site even more. That's what he would have seen at the sunrise. Why is it a calendar? Because it allows you to mark every day of the year. As the sun sets, it tells you, it shows you the movement of the sun every day of every week of the year. And in summer, the sun reaches this edge here and drops off, and it starts to move back. And in winter, it reaches the edge over there, it drops off, and that's how your year goes. Very simple. That's the view on the winter solstice. The sun sets between these two stones here, and that's why they carved that edge of that monolith, of that calendar stone, to allow the setting sun to cut across that edge and reach the distant edge of the second calendar stone. There's a 3D reconstructed version of the site that we had done. You can see the solstices, the equinoxes, and then those three that I'm going to come to very shortly. What else has the site exposed? Well, ancient workshop, a ritual path, the oldest carved sphinx, the first Horus hawk statue, an ancient grave which we believe to be the grave of an Anunnaki offspring, and the first pyramids ever built, according to me, and linked to Orion's belt. There's a ritual path that you can clearly see when the sun starts to set. It links the northern site, where we found another stone man. There you see the amazement on my face. And what we then called a stone woman for a while, but now we're changing our mind because the stone woman starts to look more and more like those Zimbabwe birds and those very raw, rough effigies of the Zimbabwe, the broad base to a narrow top. And I'm beginning to believe that it's more of the Zimbabwe bird. A giant ancient workshop. All along that ritual path, you see rocks like this strewn were shown, showing incredible examples of carving, chipping, shaping. And the ritual path ends in this stone man lying on his side. And it's a big boy, this. He's a big boy. He went to gym. And then when you look north, exactly north, there was a tree exactly on the horizon. And one evening when Johan and I were there, we were measuring and figuring things out. And Johan said, look at that tree on the horizon. And on the way out, it was already dark. And we stopped the car and we walked up to it. And lo and behold, guess what we found? Bang. Beautiful stone altar that the tree is growing out of. It's been greatly damaged by the wild horses there, so I recently put a fence around it to try and protect it, because the horses were really doing a lot of damage to it and rubbing themselves against it. And scratching and ripping the stones out of the... Then the obvious question people ask, well, how do you date the site? How do you know it's so old? Well, you got to use your brain. So you got to use every possible scientific approach that you can find. So we don't discard anything. We look at magnetic alignment, we look at soil shift, geology, erosion, lichen growth, archaeoastronomy, stellar alignment. Patina growth is becoming one of our best arguments, and then psychic revelations. So I'm going to start quickly with psychic revelations, because when you've got not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6, not 7, not 8, but more like 10 psychics, independent of each other, that do not know each other. One of them is Credo Mutwa, incidentally. By the way, Credo Mutwa was initiated at the site in 1937. When I showed him the copy of Adam's calendar, he burst into tears. He said he never thought he would see that sacred site again. And he begged me, he said, Mr. Michael, please go and protect it. Do whatever you can to save the site from the greedy developers. So that's why I'm here. Protecting the site from the greedy developers. Anyway, when 10 psychics tell you exactly the same things about the site, that it's the oldest structure on Earth, that it wasn't built by humans, that blah, 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 you go, okay, well, what are the odds that they can all be telling you the same thing? Well, the odds are several billion to 1. So guess what? That means that several billion to 1 chances that we are wrong. So what I'm telling you is right. That's how I see it. The geology is quite obvious. When you see some of the monoliths that have fallen over, you realize they're not part of the bedrock. They're not part of the bedrock sticking out. They were brought there from another place and put into the ground. The Black Reef Quartzite versus Dolerite. The ridge here, this is the edge of what's known as the Transvaal Escarpment. This is all Black Reef Quartzite rich in gold. Ah, surprise, surprise. And all those stones that you see up there, that's all dolerite. Very, very hard dolerite. I speak from experience. I couldn't chip off a piece of a rock on the side here, one of those rocks there. In fact, that rock there, I tried to chip off a piece of that one there. Couldn't chip it off. So the dolerite was brought from some distance away. The closest vein of dolerite is about 1 kilometer away from this, and was brought from there. Lichen growth is spectacular. These rocks, you look at the rocks on the cliff, and none of them have got lichen growth like this. It's incredible. The lichen growth on the top of those stones, it's like moss. Now this lichen grows at 1 millimeter per annum. So for it to cover this rock here will take at least 2,000 years from side to side. But now we got layer upon layer upon layer. We don't know how many layers there are, but we must take a piece off and send it to the lab and see how many layers of lichen there are, and that'll also give us a good indication of how long these stones may have been around when or how long the lichen has been growing at least. Archaeoastronomy is interesting. When you look at the satellite photograph, you can see it was originally a circle. Clearly see, you can see the tree at the top there gives us a nice marker for north. And the tree, there are rocks underneath, by the way. The trees aren't the markers. The stones under the trees are the markers. And you can see that it's not lying at 12 o'clock. It's lying slightly to the left. And that's a bingo moment, because you want to find that to be able to work with archaeoastronomy, because it tells us that when this site was created, north-south was sitting there and east-west was sitting like that. So when we had it measured, we found that the angle of deviation was 3 degrees 17 minutes and 42 seconds. So now we know we're dealing with something really old. And when we apply the precession principle and the 26,000-year wobble of planet Earth, although, that might not be as accurate as we think, however, I'm still inclined to believe that it is, although we seem to have other motion that Earth goes around the sun in any case. It tells us that this has completed at least one 26,000-year cycle. And so now how many times has it gone around? But to answer that question, we need to look for other indicators. And we look at erosion, for example. This particular rock gives us a very clear indication of how long these dolerite monoliths have been around. And if you ask a geologist, they'll tell you, well, this is several million years of erosion. But we know that that's not the case, right? Because we know that it's only a few 100,000 years old. But this is an anomaly, because Credo Mutwa tells me that in the process of their initiation, they had to urinate on this rock. That's why it eroded a lot quicker than all the other rocks. Patina growth. This is a beautiful example. This is one of the monoliths at one of the ruins on the mountain close to me. It broke off at some point in time, as you can see, and yet we have about 2 millimeters of patina growth. Right there. You can see the raw rock. Okay, so when it breaks, that's what the rock looks like, and then the patina starts to grow back. And after several 100,000 years, it will all look like this again. And you won't know that it's broken. And that's what's happened up here. So we just started the scientific experiment at UPE to identify what kind of patina is and how quickly or how slowly it grows. So we'll be able to tell you. But my guess is that it's at least 200,000 years old. Sterile alignment. We know that the Orion connection has been a favorite one with ancient civilizations. The pyramids aligned with Orion. The Mayan pyramids are linked. Great Zimbabwe also incidentally is linked to Orion. The Chinese pyramids seem to be linked to Orion. That's the view from there of the Chinese pyramids. So we thought, well, is it possible, since our site is so important and so old, that there was a link to Orion? And we looked at these obvious rocks that we missed before, 1, 2, 3. And we said, what if we lift those up and extrapolate the movement of the star? And guess what happens? Bingo. Got the perfect rise of Orion. Except, my guess is that when Orion rose and when they built this, Orion must have been flat on the horizon, because at the moment it comes up like this. I don't know. And it suddenly shows you that as you go back in time, we've done this model, as you go back in time, Orion just keeps going flatter and flatter and flatter. We've managed to get it to about 160,000 years at its flattest, but it's still not quite flat. So at the moment, our furthest calculation back is about 160,000 years, And the 75,000 years that's on the cover of the book was our very first calculation, so already we've surpassed that by more than half, more than double. Could there be a guardian bird at Adam's calendar? Of course there could. Which is the most important stone that we missed out? Was the eastern marker, the one that marks the rise of the sun on the vernal equinox. You silly Billy. So when we went and investigated, guess what we found? We pushed the soil away and we found a perfectly carved bird. And in my opinion, that's the oldest and the most precious Horus stone from which all other Horus stones originate. And that's what it looks like. Now suddenly you get a slightly different impression. You get the Horus stone facing the rising sun on the vernal equinox and the 3 stones of Orion's belt. And look, in the top right hand corner, can you see those 2 little peaks? You can just see them. You can see them a lot clearer when you're there. There you can see them in the bottom left here. It took 7 years for us to realize that there were pyramids in the valley. Jan Heine, who found the site, measured it for 5 years. It's called not seeing the wood for the trees. It's so obvious and so glaring. And when I applied the Fibonacci spiral to it, or the golden mean spiral, whatever you prefer to call it, I know there's a subtle difference. That's what happens. There's Adam's calendar. There's the burial site, the stone altar, and there are the pyramids. Bingo. There's me pointing out the remains of a ruin right next to that gold mine. You saw me sitting next to that gold mine. Well, this is the settlement right next to the gold mine, and look what's right behind me. I didn't even realize until I looked at the picture. My friend Brian took the picture of me, and I looked at, whoa, there's a pyramid right behind me. Look. And this is the gold mines right next to it. So you're starting to get the picture. We got an ancient civilization mining for gold, building pyramids, originators of the first Horus bird, and all these things that you see 200,000 years later in the north. It suddenly poses a whole different history of the human race. Not only that, but you find that Adam's Pyramid, Great Zimbabwe, and Great Pyramid are perfectly aligned along the 31 degree east. There's about a 15-degree difference, although they're in a perfectly straight line, but as you can see, it's about 15, or quarter of a degree incline to the right. I think that may have something to do with the suggestion of a crustal shift that Hapgood and Einstein and others have suggested. This may be the evidence that they were looking for but never found, because I think these guys were so accurate, they would not have made a mistake like this. So if you just pull it back a quarter of a degree, you'll have it exactly in line with the 31 degree east. And 31 in degree, the word El for Elohim, actually the numeric value for El is 31, if you didn't know that incidentally. That's another book that I'm busy working on called The Secret Numbers of God, which are going to reveal some absolutely staggering information. There's our first Sphinx. Remember, this is so old. These used to have facial features, but this all peeled off. So we don't know what the original facial structures were. And what were all these stone circles for? Energy. And this is where I end my presentation. And the rest of it you can see in our forthcoming book called Temples of the African Gods.